Welcome to this video for your Modern American History course. So this week we reach chapter 27, and frankly, we reach the Second World War. And like the last few chapters, this is one that arrives carrying a name you already think you know. Look at the title, right? Fighting the Good Fight. And listen to what Americans start calling this war almost before it was even over, and have called it ever since the Good War. I want us to kind of slow down and sit with that one word, good. The same way we sat with the word roaring in a way a few chapters back, right? Because the quote, good war is not a neutral description, it's a verdict. Just picture the images that the name conjures up, right? The flag going up over Iwo Jima, Rosie the Riveter flexing her arm, we can do it. Sailor kissing the nurse in Times Square, the landing craft dropping their ramps at Normandy, the liberators throwing open the gates of the camps. Hold that picture for a second, because exactly as we did with the Jazz Age, in a way, your job for the next few minutes here is to really kind of test your understanding. And here's how we are going to test it. And this is the most important thing that I will say in this lecture. We're not going to march through this battle or this war battle by battle, right? The chronology is in your reading, and the reading does it well. What we're going to do instead is hold up kind of three questions as they relate in many respects to your Unit 2 exam questions, and let the war help you answer them. Those three questions are the fulcrum, right? It's the thing that is going to be what we pivot around. We called it the good war, but good for whom? By what means? And at what cost? So, before we touch the war itself, let's go ahead and put the three questions on the table because they're going to organize everything. And what I want you to notice is something about these questions right away. They're not questions about the 1940s, right? They're questions about the whole era for 40 years. And the first question, for example, Q2, there on the slide, is about momentous decisions. It asks you to find the decisions that reveal either great wisdom or tragic lost opportunity. And it hands you a method, right? A three-part method that I'm going to make you practice over what we're looking at today. And for any decision, what was actually knowable at the time? What forces were pressing people who made it? And what was the alternative, the road not taken, right? Hold that kind of framework. The second question number three, right, is about violence. It asks about the reasons and the realities of the era's violence, what it costs us. And then it asks the hardest question on the entire exam in many respects. Were there any justifiable benefits? And I'll tell you right now, no chapter in this unit really pushes that question harder than this one. The third question, at least in this presentation here, right, which is your question number one, is about the politics of the 4 decades. Read through the chain of labels, right? The Roaring Twenties, the New Deal, the Fair Deal, the Conservative 50s. And here is where I have to be honest with you about this particular chapter. World War II is not one of these four labels, right? So the weight of this chapter does not really fall on question one. It falls heavily on 2 and 3, on decisions and violence. But the war plays a different role. It's a bridge in many respects. It carries you from the New Deal to the Fair Deal, right? It's this moment in which the politics does shift. And so that is what we're going to look at in terms of question number one. And as we move through the war, every slide I did tag what question this might be most important for, but by no means is that exclusive. So let's begin where the war begins for the United States, right? Which is to say, reluctantly. Here's the first thing to understand about how America entered this war. It did not march in. It was dragged in, slowly, reluctantly, against the loud preference of most of its own people. Now, while America looked inward, the world was coming apart. And I want you to resist seeing that as one big undifferentiated darkness, right? Let's decompose it. Let's pull it apart. There were three distinct totalitarian projects rising in the wreckage of the First World War and the Depression, right? Mussolini's fascism in Italy, Hitler's Nazism in Germany, and the militarists who seized control of Japan. Three different countries, three different grievances, converging on the same method: one party state, militarism, and the worship of the nation above the human being's individuality. Your reading has the mechanics of how these rose, right? The bitterness over the Versailles treaties, 30% unemployment in Germany, the appeasement in Munich. And I'm not going to rehash that here. I'm going to make the point the mechanics add up to. The democracies watched all of this happen, and again and again, and they chose not to act. And here's where the first exam question walks onto the stage, right? Because American isolationism was not just a mood, it was law. In the mid 1930s, Congress passed a series of neutrality acts that deliberately tied Franklin Roosevelt's hands. No arms sales, no loans, no Americans sailing on ships of nations of war. And here's the moral edge of that isolationism, the one that the chapter will not let you look away from. That same fear of being drawn in is the reason the United States turned away refugees who were fleeing the very evil it would soon be fighting. In 1939, Roosevelt would not back a bill to admit 20,000 Jewish children. That same year, a ship called the SS St. Louis, carrying nearly 1,000 Jewish refugees, was turned away from American waters and sent back to Europe. So look at that, right? The nation that would later call this the Good War spent the pre war years, the years before, refusing the war's first victims. And that's not a footnote, that's a part of understanding the decision making process here. That is the first momentous decision, in a way, at least one of this particular conflict. And it's the textbook's clearest example of a tragic lost opportunity this early. Now, watch how Roosevelt moves the country toward war, not in one leap, but by inches, right? Cash and carry in 1939. You may buy our weapons if you pay cash and carry them on your own ships. Then the first time peace draft in American history in 1940. Then in 1941, the Lend Lease program. The United States can now, quote, sell, lease, or transfer weapons to any nation vital to its defense. And it ultimately ships some $45 billion of war material to Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. Now, Lend Lease, it was basically the end of neutrality. America was now the arsenal of democracy in everything but name. And that too was a decision. And then the whole argument ends in a single morning, December 7th, 1941, right? Pearl Harbor. The tactical story is your reading's job, right? We're not going to go over it here. The meaning is what we're going to discuss. Whatever reluctance the American people had felt evaporated in a few hours. Roosevelt called it, quote, a date which will live in infamy, and asked for a declaration of war. And Congress delivered it against Japan, December 8th. And here's the part we often forget, right? 3 days later, on December 11th, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. That's what pulled America into Europe. So look at what this one reluctant stretch of years actually hands you. Three momentous decisions, all of them certainly possible to be put into your exam questions, but the decision, and they are, right? The decision to stay neutral, the decision to arm allies short of war, and the decision to turn away refugees. And that last one, right, is quite remarkable and clear in the consequences. So America is in the war now. And the war comes home, and it does two completely opposite things to a country at the very same time. Let's take the first one on this slide. And it's the one that connects this whole chapter back to what we've been looking at. Remember how we ended the New Deal, right? We discussed how the New Deal did a great deal, but it did not actually end the Great Depression. Unemployment was still near 15% in 1940. Something else was going to finish the job, right? Something else was going to end unemployment. And this is the something else. The war ended the Depression, not the WPA, the war. The government became the customer that could not fail. It guaranteed industry's costs, it guaranteed industry's profits, and it unleashed American production on a scale the world had never seen. Corporate profits jumped about $6.5 billion in 1940 to nearly $11 billion by 1944. And here's the important point about the politics, right? Question one: it was not just tanks and planes, it was a permanent settlement. Big government and big business fused together. The modern tax withholding system, the reason taxes now come straight out of your paycheck, started here in the war. A federal government that now reached into prices, into rationing, into production, into every corner of the economy. The New Deal had refined what government is. The war made that redefinition permanent, and it made it enormous. Now, the second thing the war did at home was open its doors. Picture a country physically rearranging itself. The city like Richmond, California, goes from 20,000 people to 100,000 in 3 years. Women pour into factories. By 1943, they are the majority of the workforce in aircraft plants. Black Americans leave the rural South for war industry cities in the North and the West. And this matters. The war handed wages, mobility, and a foothold to Americans who had been locked out. But we must remember that it's limited, and we must recognize the gains for what they are. Rosie was paid less than the men whose job she had taken, and everyone understood the door was supposed to be temporary. And so when we think about the politics in question one, right here is where the New Deal's loose ends kind of get tied off. The war is a bridge to this new world. It carries the whole New Deal into what ultimately will become the politics of the fair deal. Remember that when you're thinking about the politics between the New Deal and the fair deal and how we get there, for question number one. So that was certainly the war was certainly an opportunity, but there's a contradiction, and this is at the heart of the good war question. Here's the contradiction in one sentence. This was a war fought in the name of freedom and democracy, waged by a nation that segregated the very soldiers it sent out to fight. And Black Americans saw the contradiction more clearly than anyone, and they did something with it. In 1942, the Pittsburgh Courier, right, a newspaper, the largest black newspaper in the country, launched what it called the Double V campaign. Two victories: V for victory over fascism abroad, and V for victory over racism at home. They look they took the war's own ideals, the fight against self-proclaimed master race, and they turned those ideals into leverage. How? They asked, do you fight a racist tyranny abroad with a segregated army? And that leverage produced real things. In 1941, the labor leader A. Philip Randolph threatened to march tens of thousands of black Americans on Washington. And to head it off, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, barring racial discrimination in the defense industries. The image on your slide right here is the Tuskegee Airmen, black pilots who served with such distinction that they could not be ignored, and they did it inside a segregated military. The same war that opened doors also, however, detonated the tensions of throwing people together. There were deadly race riots in Detroit and in Harlem. In Los Angeles, white servicemen and civilians hunted down young Mexican American men in what they called the Zoot Suit riots. This is the home front violence that's crucial for understanding question number 3. And here's the kind of cross period thread I most want you to carry out of this particular slide, right? The double V did not end in 1945. That leverage, that argument, that demand, you cannot fight for freedom abroad and deny it at home. That is the direct seedbed of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s that you'll look at next week. So, the refrain, good for whom? For Black America, this war was a fight on two fronts at once, and they had to win both. And in 1945, only one of them was even close to won. Now we come to the home front's potentially most glaring betrayal of the quote good fight. And it is at the same time one of the clearest exam cases in the entire unit, right? On February 19th, 1942, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. It gave the Army the power to remove people from so-called quote military areas. And the Army used it to force some 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry off the West Coast and into internment camps in the interior. Now, hold on to that, right? 2/3 of these Japanese Americans were born in the United States. They were citizens. What was knowable at the time? Let's think about the kind of momentous decision framework. What was knowable? Everything was knowable. Roosevelt's own commission study had found little real danger of disloyalty. And here's the proof. Hawaii, which was far closer to the fighting and had a far larger Japanese population, did not intern its people, and nothing happened. No intended Japanese no interned Japanese American was ever convicted of espionage or sabotage, not one. So this was not a decision made in a fog of the unknowable, right? It was knowable as unjust at the time. What forces, what forces were kind of pressing on the decision makers? Frankly, raw racism, decades of anti Asian feeling on the West Coast in particular, war panic, political pressure. And what was the alternative? Do nothing? Yes, exactly as Hawaii did. Or screen people with actual evidence rather than by ancestry. That alternative was right there on the table and it was rejected. And then there is the counterpoint that I find quite glaring. And you should think about it, right? The 442nd Regimental Combat Team was made up of Japanese American soldiers. It finished the war as the most decorated unit of its size in the entire history of the United States Army. Those men fought for this country with extraordinary courage and skill, while their own families sat behind barbed wire. Now, here's why this really carries us forward. This is not only about a kind of question to momentous decision, but it's also about violence. Violence by the state against its own citizens. And it connects straight across the 40 years of this unit, right? Put internment next to the Red Scare of the 1920s at the start of the era, the McCarthyism in the 1950s at the end of it. The same question runs through all three. What happens to freedom when the nation is afraid? And that is a question the exam is, of course, asking about this whole period and what World War II offers quite explicitly. So let's cross the Atlantic and look at the war in Europe, the theater where, if the quote, good fight is ever simply true, it comes closest to being true. And it opens with a decision: Europe first. Roosevelt decided that Germany, not Japan, was the greatest threat to the world, and he committed the bulk of American power to beating Germany first, even though it was Japan that had actually attacked the United States. Now, that's a momentous decision, and it's one that you can use for question two. And now, the image here is D Day, June 6, 1944, the landing at Normandy. More than 10,000 Allied casualties on the first day alone. It is the American image. It is the image that American keeps of this war in many respects. But we should correct the popular memory here because we need to understand the details. By the time of D Day, the German army had frankly already been broken in the east on the Russian side. The true turning point of the European war was Stalingrad, fought through the winter of 1942 into 1943. And the Soviet Union paid for that victory in tens of millions of dead soldiers and civilians. The Western Front mattered enormously, but it did not win the war by itself. And so when we think about that, something else clicks into place. The three leaders who won this war, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, right? The quote, big three, were, in the chapter's own words, quote, thrown together by a necessity to defeat common enemies. Because the alliance that is winning the war is already quietly the fault line of the next one, right? The divisions between the big three are the divisions we're going to see amplified. When we get to the bargains that the big three struck, and we will, remember that their alternatives not taken were limited by armies that were already on the ground. You cannot, with a sentence at a conference table, remove the Soviet army from the territory it has already conquered. You know, before I go on, let's look at this closely, right? This image, it shows survivors of the Nazi genocide, photographed at the moment of liberation. And I'm showing it to you, of course, with a point. I want the reason to be clear. This is the thing against which the entire war claim of goodness, the war for good, is measured. And so let's measure it. The Holocaust was the deliberate murder of some 7 million Jews in Nazi camps. Some of that number, though, were the Roma, gay and lesbian people, political prisoners, and others. This was the war's ultimate violence, and it's frankly the center of gravity of any World War II evidence in question number three. The American soldiers who liberated the camps were hardened combat veterans, 2 years into the fighting, and they were not able to comprehend what they found. One of them, describing Dachau, said that Dante's Inferno, quote, seemed pale compared to the real hell in front of him. So here's the clearest case anyone can make for this being the good war. Defeating the regime that built those camps and throwing open their gates was a genuine good, and any honest account has to say that out loud. And yet, the hardest charge against the same label, and it comes from this chapter as well. America knew. Those in power knew. It knew about the Nazi persecution of the Jews in the 1930s, and it turned the refugees away as we saw at the start. And through the war, rescue was largely never made an actual war aim. So now hold both of those at the same time, because this is crucial. The liberation of the camps is the single clearest case that this was the quote, good war. The years of looking away is the single hardest charge against that very same word. Both are true. Do not resolve the tension necessarily on your exam, right? We're not trying to morally evaluate the consequences here. We're just trying to understand the history. Now we turn to the Pacific. And this is where the quote, good fight and at what cost finally collide head on. The tide turned early at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, the first Japanese naval defeat in modern history. After that came a long, grinding strategy known as island hopping, taking the stepping stones one bloody island at a time towards Japan itself. And I want you to hold two of these islands up as examples, right? Iwo Jima and Okinawa, for one specific reason. They were horrifyingly costly. Okinawa alone cost 17,000 American dead and perhaps 150,000 civilian lives. Those casualty figures are not trivia. They're evidence base for an argument that is coming out about the atomic bomb. So remember them. But there's something else about the Pacific War that the chapter insists on. This theater was racialized in a war in the Europe was not. Look at the small image on the slide, right? And notice its caption: evidence, not decoration. That is an American wartime propaganda, and it rendered the Japanese as apes, as vermin, as something less than human. An American admiral, Halsey, could say in public, kill Japs, kill Japs, kill more Japs. And he was speaking for a great many people. I quote that not for shock, but because it is evidence. And here's the connection I need you to make back to the internment slide, right? The same racial logic that put American citizens behind barbed wire at home shaped how the war was fought abroad. The quote, good fight in the Pacific was also a race war. And a lecture that tells you only the first half of that sentence is not telling you the truth. And so when we again focus on the violence of this period, we need to look at something like this and recognize, pointing at the racial aspect of this war as an aspect of that violence. And here's where it all comes to a point, right? The bomb. This is the richest single decision in the whole unit to really boil down to those momentous decisions. And the sharpest possible version for violence. So we're going to take it slow here, right? First, the facts, plainly and without drama. The Manhattan Project, right? Los Alamos, 150,000 people, $2 billion, tested the first atomic weapon in July 1945. On the morning of August 6th, 1945, a bomb called Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima. Roughly 70,000 people died in the blast, and as many again later from radiation. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki, killing at least 60,000 more. The total across both cities is estimated somewhere between 125,000 to over 250,000 people, the great majority of them civilians. Now, the exam wants the exam questions want you to take the framework, and we're going to do it now, right? The first question is, why the bomb at all? And here the defensible case is those Pacific casualty figures we just talked about. American planners projected that an invasion of Japanese home islands could cost up to 250,000 American lives. Truman, who had been president only for a few months and who had not even known the bomb existed until Roosevelt died, chose the weapon that would end the war without that invasion. That's the case, and it is a serious one. But here's the second question, and a harder one. Why a second bomb? And why so fast? Only 3 days separated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Barely time for Japan to absorb what even happened, let alone surrender. So why? Now, one answer historians offer is the second bomb was aimed less at Tokyo than at Moscow, a message to Stalin, the first salvo in the Cold War that had not quite officially begun. Another answer by historians: by August 1945, the war had so thoroughly normalized mass killing of civilians by every side, the United States included, with the firebombing of cities throughout Germany, that no special justification felt necessary at all. Now, historians will continue to debate, and we can debate, but the exam questions do not demand an answer. It wants you to weigh it, though. It wants you to think about the hardest question in the sharpest terms. The bomb's defenders point to the invasion that never had to happen, and the lives, American and Japanese, the argument claims were saved. Its critics point to 250,000 civilian dead, the unanswered question of the second bomb and the nuclear age that has menaced the species ever since. Lives claimed to be saved by ending the war, weighed against lives taken at the end. So the exam question asking for justifiable benefits asks you to make this consideration and lay out the evidence. So the war ends, right? Germany surrenders in May 1945, Japan in late summer after the bombs. And now let's pull back the answer. The, let's pull back and kind of answer and address what we've been kind of holding off, right? Question one, the politics and the labels. And I told you at the very start that World War II is not one of the four labels of politics, right? And so what we can point to, though, is the link. World War II becomes a fulcrum, a pivot. And let's trace it, right? The Roaring Twenties gave way to the New Deal. The New Deal could not end the Great Depression, but the war did. And the war made the federal government vast and permanent. And that sets the table for the Fair Deal that comes next. World War II is the current that runs from the New Deal to the Fair Deal. And that's the place to put World War II in question one. Not in a box of its own, but a linkage, a continuity between two labels. Now look at the photograph, right? Yalta, February 1945. A dying Roosevelt with Churchill and Stalin dividing up a post-war world. And remember what I told you to kind of keep in the back of your mind in the European theater. The Soviet army was already deep in Eastern Europe, and you cannot remove an army from the ground it holds with a sentence at a conference table. So the compromises at Yalta were the bill coming due for the debts of the war. And look at what is already present at the very moment of victory. Korea, divided at the 38th parallel. Germany and Berlin, carved into four occupation zones. The United Nations, founded that October. The two superpowers already eyeing each other across the rubble. The good war ends, and the Cold War is already sitting in the room. And that's what I want you to take away from the end of this conflict looking forward. It hands the next era we're going to look at almost everything. The civil rights movement waiting inside the double V, the bomb and the standing army that became the national security state, the superpower rivalry that is about to organize the rest of this course, frankly. And so let's remember, right? And let's bring back our exam questions. For question 2, momentous decisions. There are several here that you can draw from, right? The neutrality and refusing to accept refugees, Lend-Lease, internment, the bombs, the era's violence, right? Combat, extermination, internment, and the bomb. Ask, what did it cost? And then face the hard question honestly. Were there justifiable benefits? Weigh it, even handedly, of course, with evidence, rather than just feeling your way to an answer. And about the politics, use the war as the bridge, right? The hinge that turns New Deal into the Fair Deal and turns the United States into a superpower, into the Cold War. And it's called the Good War, right? Good for whom? By what means and at what cost? It was good enough to liberate a continent and open the gates of the camps. And it was waged by a nation that interned its own citizens, turned away the persecuted, fought a race war in the Pacific, and ended the whole thing by burning 2 cities to the ground. Both of these are true, and we need to keep that in mind. And when you call a war good, what are you choosing to remember? And what are you agreeing to forget? Can a thing be good and unjust at the same time? The people who lived through this war called it the Good War and measured it against fascism. And they had every right to. The harder question, the historian's job, is whether you can hold the goodness and the injustice in the same hand and refuse to drop either one. In chapter 27, right, work carefully through the resources, work carefully through the evidence, and we'll move on to chapter 28 and the beginnings of the Cold War in the next one. See you there.